To the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych podcast. Since the 2016 presidential election, the role of social media and those who use it in influencing the outcomes of elections has been a very vibrant topic of discussion. Today we are considering the role of social media in American everyday life, how it impacts upon not only politics, but also basic rights in this country, and whether corporations have the right to usurp the place of government and impose rules that government dare not impose. So as usual, with me today are Ken, our MBTI expert, and Don. Welcome to you both.
Hi, to both of you.
And at this point, we enter a conversation that was already in progress. There's a really interesting paradox about the Fourth Amendment. And I think to a large degree, many people who look a little more deeply at the news and at what's going on have pretty much given up on true Fourth Amendment rights. We've had so much of our privacy invaded. Most of us have had I won't say most, many of us, and I myself have had the experience of, we don't have a dog, and we were discussing what kind of dog our son wants to get when he gets a dog, and the next day I had an ad for dog food come up. I think that most of us are aware that our Fourth Amendment rights have been seriously broached, that we're being listened to, and at the same time, there's this odd irony about, and a paradox, as I said at the beginning when I started to talk about the Fourth Amendment, that the Fourth Amendment is used to protect abortion rights. And so there's this, on one side, this amendment has been given power that it logically probably should not have. I mean, how, if you believe that a baby in the womb is a living human being, then there is no degree of privacy that should excuse that living human being have its life terminated. So there's that power that the Fourth Amendment has been given to protect abortion rights, while at the same time, I believe the very rights that it was crafted to protect have been pretty much completely sidelined, because we can't count on being able to have privacy on our phones, in our emails. There are television sets that watch people, and that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but during a football game, a family was actually shown being observed through their television set during the course of the game, and it was presented as, oh, isn't this great? We can see into their family room, but it's not great.
We've looked at this at the structure of the top 4 or 5 companies in the world are tech companies, and they're all seeming to display a preference for one political agenda over another, and that's a little bit scary too, because they transcend governments at that point. They're becoming a sort of a techno-fascist entity that needs a little bit of pushback, I think, from the legal system.
Yeah, from governments at large. I think this actually there has been a leapfrogging throughout history between governments or national organizations, and I don't mean organizations that are within the country, but the organization of the country as such, and any country, and then the contrasted against transnationals or corporations that bridge countries and then at sometimes those corporations get more power. People rise up, say, we want control of our government so that we can control these institutions. I think there was a really interesting dynamic that happened when Barack Obama was president, and that is that a lot of people that would otherwise have been very sympathetic to cracking down on the corporate entities that had gotten too powerful were made to feel that their government was their friend, and that as long as the leader of their government, Barack Obama, was comfortable with the big tech and all of the powerful transnational corporations, everything was cool. And I think there's going to probably emerge some pretty strong evidence that Barack Obama was not really as loyal to the country as many people suspected. It made us feel good that we had elected an African American president, but perhaps we didn't know enough about him when we elected him, and I think we'll probably learn more in the days to come.
Well, then the chain of control goes right through the lobbying function, campaign contributions. And so if we look at the largest donors to the Democratic Party, we did a chart on that on Twitter that I might put back up. But it shows heavy tilt towards the Democratic side, for better or worse. But it does open the door to that bias, which is particularly disturbing, especially in a country that prides itself on representative democracy, is having that be supplanted by an entity that also has control over the flow of information, and that's something that was never foreseen even 50 years ago, that we would have this level of cohesion between the flow of information, the political process, and the timing of world events simultaneously broadcast all in the same package. And it's a very powerful influence on the perception of the mass of people. The archetypal themes that underlie perception are portrayed in movies and on television screens, and now the news has become a form of that same entertainment.
Well, yeah, the news itself has become a power structure, and in a ways that it hasn't been in the past. These are corporate entities, and corporate entities are basically a pyramid power structure where you've got a focus of power from the top, and oftentimes the top isn't seen. In modern day, we have some of these major corporations where you have a visible person at the top. A lot of times, though, you don't, and the invisibility of it doesn't make it any less powerful.
Well, this was the brilliance of the Patty Chayefsky, the scene that came out in Network.
There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today.
In his bounteous imagination, he dreamt up a character that we can almost viscerally regard as a real thing at this point, because it's right there on the screen. And I don't think I've ever seen a more dramatic portrayal of the globalist impulse than that. I think it's about 3 minutes of footage, and it's just a brilliant summary of almost everything we're talking about. And then you remember also that this scene was constructed in the mid 1970s, before we even were used to thinking in those terms. And here it's still with us. We're talking about it right now.
One vast and ecumenical holding company, for whom all men will work to serve a common profit, in which all men will hold a share of stock. All necessities provided, all anxieties tranquilized, all boredom amused.
I think if what has happened to President Trump candidate Trump, citizen Trump, can be used to highlight how we all have had our Fourth Amendment rights. I'll just say threatened and be polite, but it's gone way beyond that. If we all can become aware of that, and if perhaps his case can be kind of a siren call to all of us to demand that our privacy be protected, I can see this long-term, this whole thing as harmful as it's been in many regards to our country and as divisive. I can see that it could be turned to a real positive for our country if it can help to restore reasonable expectation of privacy being honored.
Yeah, in a way, President Trump was an innocent bystander, almost a victim at this point. I know it's maybe hard for people to accept that after all the media framing of this, but that's probably when he lays his head down on the pillow at night, how he feels about this whole thing, as he came into the situation and has just seen this embroidered story built up around nothing that was even close to his experience and his day-to-day life. Because it's really an antitrust case. These guys are also guarding their economic territory using this censorship to forcing down the competition, which is, alternative media.
Well, we'll have to watch what happens with Facebook following this dramatic banning that has taken place, and not only conservatives but also Farrakhan, who has been pushing for Islam to be reformed, to be somewhat more moderate and less radical. So we'll be watching that.
President Trump's furious reaction to Facebook's action showcases that he is, I'm sorry to say, the Infowars president. He is promoting the same alternative universe as Infowars and sharing videos from repugnant characters.
I think something really interesting has happened here, actually has been done here. I feel like there was a push to pinch the president in a vice with this these social media constraints, this banning. I feel like they've been kind of forcing him to either publicly acknowledge and defend Infowars, which will tend to separate him from moderates, or to refuse to ignore what's happening and not offer any kind of support to Infowars. And in that case, he would be potentially divided from a large portion of his original support base. So I think they've very effectively pushed him into making a decision here. I don't know that it will have the result that they are hoping for, but time will tell.
I kind of arrived at a different conclusion from this whole thing, is that President Trump was an innocent bystander. And yes, I do. I like the summary, like of where it's going to go in the future, but it's almost not about Trump. It's about the next. It could have been anybody. He was a victim. It's like if your car gets broken into, it wasn't because it was you. It was just because you were a target. And he became the target. Fill in the blank. It could be whoever comes down the pike in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years.
I think there's a real strong tendency, and I think I can put this in psychological terms, in terms of the MBTI, that the belief, and I believe it's a false belief, that through a mistaken intuitiveness, that the more people that there are, the more herd-like we become, and the more we have to leave our individual autonomy behind. I don't believe that's true, but I believe that is out there in the ether, so to speak, that belief, and that is actually empowering a lot of this herd-like mentality.
Well, it's called, Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious, and that's an intuitive function, and it's actually it can go in both directions, the introverted intuitive or the extroverted. But the archetype of the hero, the archetype of the villain, these are all we're born with most animals don't have that. Humans have these archetypal formations in order that in functioning, we would be able to recognize these things and communicate them on a social level. So we have a very sophisticated sort of neural, intuitive network that usually was just working in the clan of, whatever tribe you were, whatever, as humans overpopulated the earth or continue to populate the earth. It didn't assume the large scale that it did later in the 1800s, 1700s with the growth.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I think a lot of people believe that the more people there are on the earth, the more socialism has to become a reality, and I believe that false belief is anchored in this misunderstanding of the collective unconscious. That's what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, it can be easily misunderstood. Sure, I agree. It has a positive and negative taxis, and it can project out. That was the point of Century of Self, was that you can harness the negative forces against a minority group, like the Nazis did with the Jews. It could be even directed towards,
or not necessarily even maliciously. I mean, I'm talking about just the naive public. People tend to believe, gosh, since there's so many of us, and a lot of people live in cities or areas where there's high population density. So people look at that and they think, gosh, we've got to leave this individuality behind us because there's so many of us. But I believe that that's an example of how our subconscious makes leaps that aren't really true.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. But we are social creatures, so we an adaptive part of that is belonging to a group. We need to belong.
Yeah. But then the American group, the American tribe, is really, from our inception, it's really about individual liberty. And there's this desire of some people to say, well, we've got to leave that behind. We can't be the cowboy nation anymore.
Right, and these are cultural. They're trying to. Certain people are trying to steer culture in one direction or another, based on other parameters. So maybe it's like some form of sexual liberation or some other attachment to a entertainer. There are a number of extroverted archetypes that can come up and prove to be guide stars for collective identity. And right, where you're saying, where the individual is forgotten and superseded by affiliation with the group. Being a member of something is more important than my individual identity, and maybe even more important than the sense data that's all around me. It can overwhelm and overrule, and actually cause a mass psychosis, which would be defined as just the complete ignorance of sense data, where your intuition becomes unmoored from sensory reality.
And so, with that, to the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, we thank you for joining us for this edition of Poli-Psych Podcast. Please click like if you have indeed liked this program. We hope that you will consider subscribing to our channel, sharing our videos with your friends, and returning to join us in the near future. Until then, take care.